I'd like to welcome you all to our Studies of Religion HSC Masterclass this afternoon, and I'd like to welcome you to Emmanuel Synagogue, where Rabbi Rafi Kaiserblueth will be presenting on synagogue services. Welcome everyone, and thank you Rafi, and welcome.
Good afternoon, and I hope we get some time to do some learning today. And in the meantime, I'm going to jump right into it. If there's any questions, as we said, please put them, or any topics or terms or anything that I may happen to say, you please make sure that you ask, and I will do my best to clarify for you. So we're going to start, first of all, in this beautiful space that we're standing in. This is a synagogue. Now, the term synagogue is actually a Greek word. In the Hebrew, it's called a Beit Knesset. And it's instructive to understand, first of all, before we get into the synagogue and services, we begin to understand the terms that we're using, okay? So a synagogue is from the Greek word synagogue, from synod, but in Hebrew, Beit Knesset. So one would assume that this would be called a house of prayer, Beit Tfilah, but it's not. Perhaps one might assume that it would be called a Beit Midrash, a house of study, because we also do some studying here. The actual name Knesset is a place, which means a place of gathering. And so the actual term, or the actual purpose of the synagogue, is a place of gathering. And so it's not that prayer and study doesn't happen here. Of course it does. But the main purpose is actually to do with bringing people together, sort of a community center, because there is prayer, there is learning, there is meals, there is all sorts of different things that happen here. So the purpose is that. The history, you have to go back a couple thousand years actually to see when the first synagogues came. And most people erroneously believe that the first synagogues were built and came into operation around the time of the second exile, around the year 70 of the Common Era. However, that's not the case. We know we have archaeological evidence about 500 or so years before that in the first exile, when the Jews were sent to Babylon after the destruction of the first temple in the year 586 before the Common Era. Now, the original synagogues that we have, or that we have evidence of, were actually two long lines of benches facing each other, and it's not entirely clear what they would have done there. The prayers that we know and understand now had not come into operation yet. Those were developed much later, probably around the first or second century of the Common Era, maybe a tad earlier. And that is, so we understand therefore that the original concept, the original understanding of the synagogue was exactly, as I said earlier, just a place for people to come together. Understand at that time for Jewish people, their entire worship service, as it were, was predicated and built and structured around the offerings that were given in the temple in Jerusalem. Obviously, with that being destroyed, they couldn't do that. However, they still needed a place where they could come together. The synagogue, or the temple, in Jerusalem was that focal point, the center of everything in the religious life of the Jews. Without being destroyed, they needed another place to fixate and to congregate. So the synagogue begins to take its place, but it wasn't until the destruction of the second temple and the dispersal of the Israelites, or the Jews, all over the world, that really the synagogue comes into its own, and the addition of the beginning of the rabbinic movement, which supplants the system of Judaism that was the priest service and the cultic worship of animal sacrifices. So the synagogue as a building, as a structure, as an entity, as with many things, has developed over time. And today, we are here at Emmanuel Synagogue in Sydney, Australia. Here, this is one of the synagogues that we're in. And if you can think about any other place of worship, of course, this one also has many different elements that are similar to any other synagogue. They may look different, but that would be a stylistic thing. Most of the synagogues that you're going to see today are going to be predicated on a model from Eastern or Central Europe. And what was the mode of worship there? They were surrounded and heavily influenced by Christianity. So you're going to see a lot of similarities between synagogues that have a lot of similarity, to churches, right? That you have the pews, people to sit, rather than being facing each other. They're going to be either arranged in a stadium or a cathedral type setting. Now you have, it's hard for you to see some of it, but one of the main features that you're going to see in every single synagogue will be the ark. This is the part that you have right behind me, and understand also the synagogue as a structure and its architecture came to be, as our Talmud, the rabbis teach, to be mikdash me'at, which means a miniature temple, right? The Jews had been worshiping at the temple for about 1,000 or so years, and so that's not something that is simply vanishes. And the influences, both spiritually and comfort-wise and historically, are going to be used to inspire the structure and the construction of synagogues all throughout the ages. So you have at the center, you have the ark, which inside the ark, you have in what the temple would have been the Holy of Holies. Here we have the actual Torah scrolls. And inside the Torah scrolls, we have 4 in here, are the 5 books of Moses. Bereshit, which is Genesis, Shemot, which is Exodus, Vayikra, Leviticus, Numbers, which is Bemidbar, and Deuteronomy, which is Devarim. And that is the part of the synagogue structure that we always focus to. And it is pointed in a direction here towards Israel. Okay. Now, we also have on top here, you can't really see it, but there's a Ner Tamid, an eternal light, which is there, which is representing the eternal light that would have been there at the temple, that would always have been kept burning. We also have here, which I have all my notes and the computers on, is what's called the Bima, which is the place where we offer our words. In the temple, that would have been the place where the animals would have been offered. Now, just a word on the term sacrifice. It's actually a terrible translation for the word korban in Hebrew. In the Jewish understanding, we would have offered a korban, which, as I said earlier, is normally translated as a sacrifice. However, the term doesn't mean that. Literally, it comes from the word karov, to come close to. And so the objective of offering an animal or a bird or some flower or whatever it is was not to sacrifice yourself or sacrifice anything of your wealth. It would be lehakriv, to come close to God. That was the purpose. And the same token now, when we offer, instead of animals, we offer our words. That is how we do it. And so there in the temple, they would have done it on the altar. Here, we do it on the bima, which is the stand or the table or the desk, and it serves the exact same function. We also have the symbol here, the menorah. That is actually the symbol of the Jews. Many people misunderstand that the Star of David is a symbol of the Jews. It's actually not. First of all, Magen David literally means the shield of David, not the star. And how that came to be used or identified as a Jewish symbol is a long and complicated history. But the menorah is actually our symbol. Why? Because we are known as Jews as our mission is to be a light unto the nations. And so that is makes a lot of sense then, that would be our symbol, not a device or a shield used in wartime. Plus, it's not historically actually clear if King David would have actually used a shield in that design. It's not that it didn't happen, it's just a little bit ambiguous historically. So, but it's also an understanding in Judaism, and you can see here, the menorah, which means a lamp, is a 6 or 7 branched lantern or a lamp. And that would have been in the temple, one of the holy objects, along with the ark, which carried the 10 Commandments, the tablets, the symbol of the covenant between the Jewish people and God. The menorah also would have been figured very prominently in that service as well. That would have been lit every single day. With regard to the story of Hanukkah, that is the item that they're speaking of, except now when we celebrate Hanukkah, we use a kind of menorah, but it's slightly different in that it's a Chanukiah. It's a lamp that is specifically used for Hanukkah, so it looks a little different than that. It's actually an 8-branched one with a 9th one as a little helper to remind us of the holiness the miracle, excuse me, of the Festival of Lights, that the oil, which was only supposed to last one day, lasted for 8 days. So the synagogue, if you walk into any single synagogue, you're going to notice a few different things. You'll know that you're in a synagogue. You'll see that there's an ark with this, the eternal light, which is just up here, menorah, and also facing in a certain distinction, in a certain way, with the table where all the worship happens. So that is how you know that you are in a place of worship, a Jewish place of worship, a synagogue. Now, we also, as I said, we face towards Israel because for Jews, spiritually, that is our home. We cannot exist without that connection to our spiritual homeland. We're taught that when you're outside of Israel, you pray facing towards Israel. If you're in Israel, you face Jerusalem. If you're in Jerusalem, you face the Temple Mount. And if you're on the Temple Mount, you face towards the Holy of Holies. That is our spiritual data point. That is our central space, and we're always focused towards there when we pray. So that is a bit of the synagogue and what we and all the things that we do in here. You're going to notice some differences in different synagogues based on structure, history, culture, but also movement and stream. In our synagogue here, we have 3 different prayer spaces. This one, and we alternate between which community is using it, but they're all in essence the same format in that there's no separation between men and women. In other synagogues of an Orthodox persuasion, they will have a separation of varying different degrees, whether it's simply separate seating with no barrier. Some will have a very low barrier. Some will have a slightly higher barrier. Some will have them physically removed in that they are on a higher, on a platform or a balcony or in a different room. It depends on the structure and the background of those different communities. So the Reform and Masorti conservative side will have men and women sitting together, and indeed men and women will be participating, leading the service, whereas in an Orthodox synagogue, in Orthodox communities, that is not the case. You also have some distinctions geographically, whereas Jews who are from North Africa and the Middle East, their synagogues will have a lot more in common architecturally with a mosque, for obvious reasons, because that is the predominant culture, and they will have architectural similarities, just as Jews who come from Eastern Europe and Central Europe, they will be heavily influenced by church design. So moving into prayer and service itself, it's interesting, as I alluded to, the prayers there is a history of prayers in the temple, in the Torah, in the Bible. And one of the earliest prayers that we have is more of a spontaneous prayer. And that is the story where Moses' brother and sister, Aaron and Miriam, they gossip against Moses. And curiously, only Miriam is punished, the sister. Not the first time in religious tradition that women carry the brunt, not the men. But she's afflicted with some sort of skin disease, irritation, a rash of some sort. And Moses prays for her and says in Hebrew, Al na rafa na la. God, please heal her. 6 words. That's it. That is the prayer, that one of the first ones that we have recorded in our tradition. Obviously now in our tradition, prayers are slightly a bit longer, but it gives us an understanding, at least the beginnings of what prayer can be. So we have 2, I suppose, sources for when our fixed prayer began. One of them is based on our ancestors, our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the different prayer services are attributed to the different forefathers. Abraham is taught that he is the one who initiated the morning service, based on a source that he is out in the morning, and Isaac, because he was walking out in the fields in the afternoon, so that would be the afternoon service, the mincha service. And Ma'ariv, the evening service, is attributed to Jacob because he's out at night also having a conversation with God. The other understanding is based on the sacrificial system that was established for the temple, that there was an evening a morning and an afternoon service. And I deliberately say it in that order because that is the way that our calendar is set up. We have, if you look at the beginning of chapter 1 of Bereshit, of Genesis, at the end of each day of creation, it says, Vayihi Erev, Vayihi Boker, Yom Rishon, or whatever day it is, which translates as there was evening and there was morning on the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth day. Now, it writes it that way because for us, we understand that there is the beginning of the day is in the evening, at sundown. So now you can't really see out the window, but the sun, the shadow's starting to get longer. So in about an hour or two, today, Wednesday, will be finished. And about now in the winter, about 5 o'clock, 4:30, 5 o'clock, the day will finish and the new day will begin. So later this afternoon, evening, it already will be Thursday. And we know this because also our Shabbat, the Sabbath, begins on Friday evening, not Saturday morning, right? Most of us are used to the fact that the calendar flips over at midnight, not for us. And so the first service of the day is actually the evening service. The morning service is the second, and the afternoon service is the last service of the day. Now, it's I suppose a little bit instructive on getting into how we pray. Now, there are two different there's many different, as Jews, we live in tension with a lot of different things. In prayer, there's a few different tensions that you need to be aware of. Number one is the needs of an individual versus the needs of the community. But there's also understanding of when you pray, there's a fixed element, which we call keva, and the intention or the thought, which is the kavanah. Put simply, it's what we do versus how we're supposed to do it or what we're supposed to feel when we do it. And so those two things live in tension. There are some communities who really fixate on the words, that it's very important that we say things all together and completely, versus other communities who will say, no, it's actually really important to make sure that we are feeling or thinking properly. And I'm going to show you a couple different texts from our tradition that highlight this tension. But first of all, understand that for us Jews, the individual normally is not thought of as important, but the community is. We thrive by being in community. And therefore, in many cases, the ideal form of prayer is actually in a prayer quorum of at least 10 people. Now, again, this highlights another distinction between the movements. The Reform and Masorti, or conservative streams, will be fine with counting anybody who is Jewish over the age of bar or bat mitzvah, over the age of majority, which is typically 13. In some communities, 12 for girls. And as long as you have 10 people or more, then it is sufficient. There are, the Orthodox would say, no, only men are counted from the age of majority of 13. They will count towards a prayer quorum. We're going to come back to in a little bit about what you can or can't do in the quorum of the service. But we're going to look now at the first tension, or I suppose the second tension, of the fixed part versus the intention. So our rabbis teach us that it's Maimonides, Rambam. He was a philosopher, a legal scholar, a surgeon as well, and a commentator on all the Bible. That one of the things is to pray daily is an affirmative duty, and to serve God with all your heart, which is a quote from Deuteronomy. On which the sages commented, what may be described as service of the heart? The answer to that is prayer. Now, it's interesting that in the Torah, in the Jewish tradition, avodah is the service, literally means service. Okay? And typically that is what they're referring to the service that would have happened in the temple. Okay? And hence we come with the term services when we come here to pray. Now, we don't necessarily need to pray in the synagogue. Judaism is actually very concerned with when you are. It's not necessarily so important where you are. I've had personally services here in the synagogue, obviously, on board a ship, on an airplane, in the middle of the desert, in the forest, in a park, you name it. There's actually very, very few places you're not allowed to pray for obvious reasons, such as in the bathroom or in a garbage tip. But otherwise, if the time to pray is at this point, then you do what you can to pray at that point. When is important, not necessarily where. So Maimonides continues, the number of prayers is not prescribed in the Torah. No form of prayer is prescribed in the Torah, nor does the Torah prescribe a fixed time for prayer. Hence, so it's an interesting thing that he's saying there. And so the rabbis understand that there needed to be some sort of fixed sense of what we needed to do, because we are a community, we are people who put a premium on group activity, just like you have in any team sport, correct? There is an understanding that if you're going to be there on the field sharing the activity, there needs to be an understanding that we're all doing it together, reading from the same book of rules, the same uniform, and the same referee. And otherwise, you can't have someone on one soccer pitch playing soccer, someone else playing rugby, someone else playing cricket. You're going to have chaos. We want to have a group worship, and that's one of the main ways, not the only way, but one of the main ways that we come together to celebrate and to praise. And so one of the things that we talk about is the fixed prayer. So what does that look like? The earliest prayers would have been what's called the Shema and its blessings. Now the Shema it's hard to describe it as a prayer, but it's a declaration of faith. And that is what we say 3 times a day. In the morning service, we say it in the evening service, and traditionally we say it right before we go to sleep. Jews also, one of the first things we teach our children is the Shema. And traditionally, also when someone converts, the first thing they say when they become Jewish is the Shema. And if you're able to, the last thing you say before you pass away is the Shema. Now, what is the Shema? Well, it's a quote from the Bible, from the Torah, the book of Deuteronomy, chapter, and it says, the Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, or God is one. Adonai is one. And there's lots of different interpretations of what that means. And I should say actually different translations, depending on which prayer book you use. If we use this book, this is the one that we use in the Masorti service, the conservative service. And that'll translate it slightly differently than what it does here. This is the book that we use in the progressive service. If I bring in an Orthodox prayer books, which I have as well, several of them, all slightly different translations of it. But the idea, the main thrust of this concept is that there is one unity that connects all of us Jews together. And then it continues, and you should love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And these things that I teach you today, you should be inscribed on your hearts, and you should teach them diligently to your children when you ride down and when you rise up, when you're in the room, when you're on the road or when you're at home. You shall bind them as a sign on your arm and a reminder between your eyes, and you should inscribe them on the doorpost of your home and your gates. That is the essence. There's other parts of it as well, but that is the kind of the main declaration of our identity, of our faith, that we say 3 times a day. And then the service sort of grew from either side of that to include other blessings and other prayers. The Baruch Hu is the first part of that mandated part, is a fixed part that is, in essence, what I would call a call to prayer. Many other religions have that. Islam has that. Christianity has that. Whenever you're doing worship as a group, you need some way to key everybody on to saying that we're going to start now. Okay? And then you have that. You have a few different blessings. You have the Shema, and then you have one more blessing, and then you have the main prayer of any worship service is what's called the Amidah, which is the prayer, the standing prayer. Okay? Now, the standing prayer is sometimes called the Shmona Esrei, which literally means 18, which is interesting because it has 19 blessings. At one point, many hundreds of years ago, it did have 18 blessings, but another one was added. But the term in Hebrew, Shmona Esrei, is so catchy, so we just stuck, so we still call it the Shmona Esrei. But also, it only has 19 blessings during the weekday. On Shabbat and festivals, it does not. We'll come back to that. So we have the fixed part, which many of the rabbis teach. At the discussion in our texts is actually not very difficult. It tells us that we need to say, this is from the Mishnah, the earliest, one of the earliest collection of laws that the rabbis tell us. We learned in the Mishnah that Rabbi Eliezer says, one whose prayer is fixed, his prayer is not supplication. The Gemara asks, what is the meaning of fixed in this context? Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi says that Rabbi Oshaya said, it means anyone for whom his prayer is like a burden upon him, for which he seems to be quickly unburdened. The rabbis say this refers to anyone who does not recite prayer in the language of supplication, but as a standardized recitation without emotion. Rabbah and Rava, both, it's anyone able to introduce a novel element. And so there is a whole bunch of discussion, not a lot of discussion, about when we pray, which is morning, afternoon, evening, and the main elements of the written prayer, which is, as I said, the Baruch Hu, the call to prayer, the Shema, that call of our identity, and the collection of blessings that really encompass many aspects of our lives. That's the fixed part. That's Keva. And it doesn't occupy a huge amount of discussion because there may be some points on how late can you say it. So there's some rabbis in the Mishnah who say you have to do it before midday for the morning service, for example. And the afternoon can only be at a fixed point between afternoon and before sunset. And the evening can only be after midnight, or after sunset before midnight. Not very controversial topics, I would assume. Where it gets really dicey, where it gets really complicated, I suppose, is the other part, the kavanah, the intention of what you're supposed to think or how you're supposed to feel when you say these prayers. And this is where the rabbis get a little bit more difficult because there are some who say that this is from a part of the Talmud. Rabbi Chia Bar Ashi said that Rab said, anyone whose mind is unsettled should not pray. As it is stated, when distressed, one should not issue decisions. The Gemara relates that Rabbi Hanina, on a day that he was angry, would not pray, as he said that it was written, when distressed, one should not issue decisions. So this is quite mind-blowing, is that there's a rabbi who's saying if your brain, if your heart and your soul are not into what you're doing, you shouldn't do it. There are other opinions of rabbis who say that no, you actually should do it again and again and again until you get the right feeling. There are other rabbis who say that if your prayer doesn't count unless you add something novel or unique every day, right? It's not a real prayer if you haven't actually added something rather than just what's written there. And so there's a real tension that our tradition is teaching us that it's not enough to just say the words that are here in the prayer book. It's really important that space is given. And this is what we see in our prayer service when we come together here in the synagogue, is that we give that time and we embrace that tension. By doing worship together, we sing together, the prayers, we do it at mostly at the same pace. However, in each of these services, we also make sure to give time for people who are praying on their own, whether that be a private prayer in the prayer book itself, in the Hebrew or in the English, or whatever prayers of their heart and their soul. Okay. Now, question also is, what language do we pray in? Most of the time, it's in Hebrew in the Masorti service. An Orthodox service also would mostly be in Hebrew. In the Progressive or Reform service, sometimes there are some Hebrew, there's some English, and it's going to depend really on where and who is leading that service. But the idea is they want people to be able to understand what's happening. And so there's a lot less Hebrew in some of the progressive services, whereas other traditions, the Masorti and the Orthodox, will find it important to make sure that we keep in common with one another. In that I mean, I can go to a synagogue here in Australia or the United States or in Europe or in South Africa or wherever the case may be, and the prayers are basically the same. And I've been in services in Europe all over, in the United States, South America, and Canada, here in Australia, in Singapore, and the prayers are the same. Yes, there's some regional differences in the tunes they may use, but the prayers are the same. And they are based on this structure. The morning service is a lot longer. I said it started with the Baruch Hu, the call to prayer, the Shema, and the Amidah. Later on, the rabbis added quite a bit more to it. And I want you to think about it as exercise, right? The first thing you do when you exercise is you warm up. That would be what we call the morning blessings. Traditionally, those would have been done at home before you came to the synagogue to pray. But the morning blessings are sometimes translated or said to be gratitude for daily miracles, which is a great translation for it, even though it's not literal. It's every step of your morning routine is something to be thankful for. Being able to open your eyes, be conscious, to be able to use the facilities, to go to the bathroom, to make sure that every single part of your body is working properly. That's something to give thanks for. To the point that once you take care of your basic needs, then there's an understanding that you're going to get on with your day and be part of something larger than yourself. That is the stretching, right? The warm-up, the morning blessings. In Hebrew, Birkot HaShachar. The next part of the morning service is called, in Hebrew, Pesukei de Zimra, which is literally, it's called, translated as introductory psalms. That would be the warm-up, or the stretching, right? Where you begin to get ready to exercise. If you don't, but in this case, you're not exercising physically, it's your soul. And we come to that part once we finish those, and that's mostly made up of, as it says, from selections from the Book of Psalms, from the third section of the Torah, of the Jewish Bible, writings. Once we finish that, then we come to the main part of the exercise, which is the morning blessings, which is that main part that we said, the Baruch Hu, the call to prayer, the Shema, and the Amidah. And then you warm down with some concluding psalms, and the service finishes. That is the structure of the main of the morning service. The afternoon service is composed of just one psalm, basically one psalm, the Amidah, and a concluding psalm. And the idea that's simply practical is that if you're out in the middle of work in the afternoon or in the fields or wherever you may be, you don't have time to do a long service. So the afternoon service is actually quite short. The evening service is also not very long. It's slightly longer, but it consists of basically that part that we said, the call to prayer, the Shema, and the Amidah, and a concluding psalm. That's it. That's the evening service. Now, on occasion, we will have a slightly different format of the service. For example, on Monday and Thursday mornings, we will read from the Torah, the weekly portion. That is done a small part of the weekly portion. Normally, each book, as we said, is divided into weekly portions, and each weekly portion is divided into 7 readings. On Monday and Thursday morning, we read the first reading of that weekly portion divided into 3. And so just like when you go to the gym, every once in a while, you're going to put a little bit extra effort into, say, arm day or leg day, or you push yourself a little bit harder. On Monday and Thursday, we push ourselves a little bit more by reading. History there probably comes from a time when they would have read on market days. The more people would have been there, so they would have read from the Torah, from the Bible, to gather to a larger collection of people than they would have normally had. That tradition continued in the synagogue, where the prayers would have happened, and we would have read on Monday and Thursday today. So tomorrow morning, if you want to come join me here in the synagogue, I'll be here reading some of the weekly portion. On festivals such as Shabbat, that is a little bit of a longer service because on the evening service, there's a whole section called Kabbalat Shabbat, which literally means welcoming Shabbat, which is composed of 8 psalms, actually not 7, and 1 poem. The idea is 7 psalms for each day of the week. And the 8th psalm, because it teaches us that Shabbat is there to give us a taste of the Messianic era. And so we sing these songs mostly in Hebrew, and the progressive service does that with musical instruments. The Masorti service and Orthodox services would not typically have musical instruments involved in that, but simply a cappella singing together. The morning service is a bit of an extended service. The introductory part is the part that you would normally do on weekdays, but there's an addition of, again, 8 psalms for the same reason as on Friday night. And then we do the full weekly portion in the Masorti service. In the progressive service, they do a little bit less. And in the Orthodox service, they would do the full service, the full weekly portion as well. We have an additional reading from the book of prophets, which is called the Haftarah, which is literally an additional part. That probably stems from historically when the Romans occupied the land of Israel. Well, it wasn't called Israel then, and prohibited the reading of the 5 books of Moses, because these are really much more integral and important than the books of prophets and writings. Not that they're not important, but these are seen as more foundational. The Romans prohibited the reading from the 5 books of Moses, so the rabbis instituted a system from the books of prophets, parts that would connect with the weekly portion that we couldn't read. So whether that would be based on themes from the weekly portion, the calendar, whatever the case may be, we kept that tradition once we were able to begin to reintroduce reading of the Torah. And so we have that on Saturday morning as well. And then in the Masorti conservative service and an Orthodox service, we have an additional service, which is called Musaf, which literally means additional. That stems from likely the sacrificial system. On a festival, they would have had an additional service, additional offering, that would have been given on those days that were, it wasn't just the weekly offering that they would have done, the daily offering. They would have given an additional service, an additional offering as well. And that you have, that's the same basic structure on festivals as well. So just a couple days ago, we had the festival of Shavuot, Feast of Weeks, and on Sunday and Monday. And so the service followed that pattern of, there's an additional part that we do of psalms together, of psalms of rejoicing and celebration because it's a festival. But the service itself would have been that basic structure. Now, and so you have this idea of praying in a quorum, praying together. That is what's called a minyan. Okay, 10 people over the age of bar mitzvah in a progressive and a Masorti setting. In an Orthodox setting, it would only be 10 men above the age of 13. So that allows us to do certain things in the service that we wouldn't necessarily be able to do, such as reading the Torah. If we don't have a quorum, we can't do that. If you don't have a quorum, there's also the call to prayer we wouldn't do because you're not having a group large enough to call to prayer. There's also the prayers that we say for the mourners. We would not be able to say those without 10 people being present. And so those are the differences you would see if you walk into a service and those things aren't done. It's probably because we don't have a quorum of 10 people. We're usually really good about getting that here. It does happen from time to time that we're a little late. People have a little bit of a lie-in, and so they're a little bit late getting here. But we typically do always get that. Some of the things that we use, while we pray, is our the prayer shawl called a talit. It needs to be the basic regulations. Any 4-cornered garment. And so on the cornered garment, you will have these tassels. They're called tzitzit. And the way it works is we put it on, and there's a blessing that we say, which is, praise are you, God, sovereign of the universe, who commands us, whose commandments add holiness to our lives by commanding us to, in this case, wrap ourselves in the talit. Now, it's interesting in that the concept is not to wear the talit, but to wrap ourselves. And this is taught as being a representation of our tradition. And so this is what we wear in the morning service. We don't wear this in the afternoon or the evening. The afternoon, potentially only if you're the one leading the service, and the evening service, typically no one wears one. We also have on weekdays, mornings, we have what's called tefillin. These leather boxes with straps. Inside them are selections from the Torah, which talk about this 4 different places in the Torah. One of them is in the book of Deuteronomy, and 3 of them are in the book of Exodus, where it tells us about the concept of binding ourselves. Ukshartam leot al yadecha vehayu letotafot beinenecha. This is, you should bind them as a sign on your arm and a reminder between your eyes. This is one of the physical reminders of the covenant that we have made and the relationship that we have with the Almighty. And so we wear them in different interpretations. Some of them say because your arm is the seat of your physical power and your head is the seat of your intellect. And so you wear to compass, to really embody this idea that you shall love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, which is an idiom, really, everything you have. And so our ancestors would have worn these all day long. They would have been a lot smaller than this, but we have archaeological evidence from over 2,000 years ago. Tefillin, sometimes translated as phylacteries, exactly the same as these, with the same text, the same parchment on the inside, exactly the same, except smaller, that they were wearing. So the same things that I wear every morning, my ancestors over 2,000 years ago were wearing as well. Now, we don't wear them all day any longer. They did. We also don't wear these on festivals or Shabbat. So just weekdays, Sunday through Friday morning. And that is the sort of the uniform, if you will, if you're praying. These are also, by the way, only worn by people above the age of bar or bat mitzvah. In a progressive or Masorti service, you will see men and sometimes women wearing them. They are allowed to wear them. In an Orthodox synagogue, women will not be wearing the talit or the kippah, or the tefillin. Also, you see the kippah that we're wearing. That is traditionally not just worn in the synagogue. It is also worn, I wear mine all the time. Someone asked why. It's lots of different understandings there. Some has to do, in terms of Jewish practices and rituals, the kippah is actually relatively new in terms of, and it's not really mandated in the same way, in the same weight. But most, or some would say that it comes from this concept of a reminder of that there's always someone above you. There's always someone with you. You're not able to always be that perfect individual doing what you're supposed to do always. It's required a necessity, a reminder to have that person there with you, because sometimes we need that reminder of how we're supposed to behave. So the differences then of the prayer services are constructed in a way to give voice to that fixed prayer and also the expression of the individual. We also have to balance the individual in terms of what we say together and what we say as a community. When you come into a service, it can be a place of great comfort, joy, celebration. So what else happens in here are life cycle events. People will typically come to a synagogue when they are celebrating the birth of a child to do the naming, a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah, which is a coming of age ceremony of young 12 and 13-year-old boys and girls. You also have people when they're remembering a loved one, when they're in mourning. and again, it comes back to the main function of the synagogue, is a place of gathering. Yes, prayer happens here. Yes, learning happens here. But those things would look like in old times, or in ancient traditions, for example, someone coming for a kala, for a bar bat mitzvah, it would simply be they come up and we bring the Torah out, someone's reading it, and they have what we call an aliyah, or a call up to the Torah, and they'd say the blessing, and it's read, and that's it. Modern times now, it's different. Now it looks that the student, the child, will do quite a bit of the service. They will read some of the Torah. They will do a little bit of the teaching. For Masorti and progressive synagogues, there is no distinction between what a male and a female child will do. In an Orthodox synagogue, they'll look quite different. The boys will be able to do what I described. Girls do not get a call up. They're not typically allowed to come up to the Torah. So they will do a teaching of some sort, and that's going to vary, because understand the inclusion of women in Judaism is a relatively new thing. Just like in our secular society, inclusion of women is, which many of us take for granted, is not actually such an old thing, that women were treated the same as men. So it's in a continually evolving, and even when I say Orthodox, that is not a monolithic approach. There are different Orthodox communities that have varying degrees of women participating, from nothing at all to a separate service for women that they are allowed to read on their own without men being present, and even some Orthodox that allow women to do certain things in the synagogue service. So as we say in life, the reality is somewhere there in the middle, in the gray areas. A lot of nuance and a lot of gray areas of understanding exactly how this breaks down, based on communities of where they are, also will make a big difference. So I'd like to, if there's any questions, feel free to start putting them here in the panel, in the questions there. I'll happily answer anything specific, but this is a brief overview of our synagogue and the synagogue services. Again, there is a breakdown of the various different services that we do: evening, morning, afternoon. Major times that we come together, by the way, in here are obviously the festivals. The biggest ones that people come are the high holidays: Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, and the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, where we will see normally on a weekday service we'll have 15 or so people. A Shabbat will have anywhere from 20 to 50 people if there's no life cycle event happening. This weekend there's a relatively big bar mitzvah, so we'll probably have well over 100 people. On high holidays we'll have to open up this wall behind me, and we'll have about 600 people in here. In the progressive synagogue, they'll have at the height about 1,100 on the high holidays. Normally we don't. That's just on the synagogue, on the services part of it. Obviously in here we also do weddings will happen from time to time in the synagogue. Funerals will happen here. Baby namings, the whole spectrum, the whole range of of life cycle events will happen here. But as we like to say also, if it's not happening in the home, then the synagogue is somewhat superfluous. It's great to bring people here together, but Judaism, the basic foundational unit of Judaism really is the family. And if it's not happening at home, this is not fulfilling that purpose. People will come here and we will run programs, we'll run events, and we'll do services and prayer and offerings and all those sorts of things. But it needs to be an inspiration to take home and recreate and continue doing that in the home. I will open up to any questions. If you would like to write them here, here's the chat window. If there's any questions people would like to ask, I will give you an opportunity now to do that. You have a rabbi here standing in a synagogue, can offer you any questions. If you need some more sources, I can help you, point you in that direction as well. Question from a student: how do women receive guidance from the Torah if it is only for men to read? Excellent question. So the question is, how do women receive? The women are still in a progressive or Masorti context. The women are actually here, and so there is not just the reading where we read it out loud, but we also the rabbi will also then do, or anybody really, but usually the rabbi will do a sermon where they will speak on that weekly portion. So everybody actually, and the idea is everyone's supposed to hear the reading of that weekly portion, not just the men. In an Orthodox setting, the men hear it. The men are there and they're able to approach and have the honor for the call up, but women are still typically present. And so they do hear the reading as well. And I neglected to explain why we call it an aliyah or call up. Is in older structures of the synagogue, you would have had literally a raised platform where the Torah would have been placed on the lectern and read. And so you physically had to go up, climb up some stairs. So hence in Hebrew, aliyah means to literally go up. You can also use the term aliyah in a spiritual sense, that when you move to Israel, you're going up in spiritual significance. And so it's called aliyah as well. So physically aliyah when you go up for an honor for the reading of the Torah, and there's also aliyah spiritually when you go to Israel. Any other questions? One of the things that we say, I neglected to mention, we typically don't say silent prayer. We say private prayer, and that comes from the story of Hannah, as you would say in the book of Samuel. She goes, she's barren. She doesn't have children. And she goes to the tabernacle at the time, not the temple hadn't existed yet. And she goes and a priest sees her, the priest Eli, sees her standing in front of the altar, and her lips were moving, but there was no words. It says, now Hannah was praying in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice could not be heard. So Eli, the priest, thought she was drunk. So the idea there is, we say you should be praying loud enough that you can hear it, your lips will move. And so normally we wouldn't say silent prayer, we say a private prayer. And so it's a distinction that is important. And so it's not that communal prayer is the only way to pray. And some would say it's the ideal way to pray. It's just, I would say it's more the dominant way, but not the only way. There's absolutely room and space for the individual to pray, but we put a premium on communal activity. Some people are not comfortable with and don't enjoy being in public, but still it's something new for people to understand and be a part of. So for example, when we do bar mitzvah or baby naming or whatever it is we're doing here, it's not that person's service. It's still a communal service. It belongs to the community. And the person who's coming for the honor, say for a baby naming or for a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, or for a couple who's about to get married, all of those things, people in the community are still here. You can invite your guests, but the community is still here present, part of what's happening. And so if you're not used to coming to synagogue, that might be a little bit jarring because you'll see an invitation for the service of celebrating so-and-so's honor or celebration or whatever. It's implied for Jews understanding that, yes, it's based on the community, so everybody is allowed to be here. Everybody comes to celebrate, regardless if you know them directly or not. And then, of course, there's a meal and a drink after the service, because one of the most social things that we do is food. And so if everything is predicated on community, of course we're going to have food afterwards. So there's that joke where there's Jews, there's food. Well, it's based on truth, right? Even the days where we fast, we talk about food, the breaking of the fast. It's still something that we focus on. Are there any major theological differences between the variants of Judaism? Yes. And that could be a whole hour session on that. But theologically, you have to understand the basis of where that differences come from. So, and they all stem from how they understand and interpret the divinity, I suppose, of the Torah and the divine texts. whereas Orthodox would say that they are divine, written by God, and therefore they have authority, and it's very difficult to change things very slowly over time. Masorti would say that they are probably divinely inspired, not necessarily written by God, and there are tools and ways in which we can alter them with processes, whereas progressive would say these are probably written by humans, and therefore the tradition has a vote, but not a veto, is one of the things that they say. And so, yes, absolutely, things alter. And so that theological difference is really the underpinnings of all the differences between the different streams. There's lots of things in common, but there are certain places where they're diverged because of these distinctions. And so that's, you see that played out, for example, by women being included, right? Orthodox would say, and even that is beginning to change in certain communities, that they're beginning to incorporate women more and more. But just for a long period of time, historically, women had different gender roles. They were not included in society, and therefore, by extension, in the synagogue service. That is beginning to change, as we see with the change of the role of women in society as well. At your synagogue, do you incorporate Hasidic melodies? Yes, we do. Depending on which service and which stream, and the Masorti, and also, by the way, who's leading it. The idea is it's meant, the role of the prayer leader. If you can envisage, one of the examples I give sometimes is a unit marching in a military fashion. You have the person off to the side calling cadence and calling a tune, and they have to do it with him or her. That same sort of way as a prayer leader. As I'm leading the prayers, I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it with you, but I'm keeping everybody together on the same rhythm, on the same pace, on the same page. And so sometimes that person leading it will use a Hasidic melody, sometimes a more modern melody, sometimes a more traditional, if you will, tune. The Hasidic, which you had Rabbi Mordecai speak about 2 weeks ago, that is a very emotional, ecstatic experience. And a lot of what they use is these melodies to raise, they become very repetitive, but very moving as well. Another question. Are there, yeah, we did that one. I think we did that one. Yes. Wonderful. Oops. Great.
Yes, I would like to say thank you so much to Rafi for his presentation today, and I am sure that you've all gained such a great depth of knowledge and understanding, and I think a real understanding of the streams of Judaism and how synagogue services, prayer is actually part of adherents' lives, and how they do it has got familiar and similar ways, but also there's some differences, as Rafi has shown us, with the streams of Judaism. We're very, very thankful for Rafi, and I'm sure in your chat you'd like to say thank you as well. And certainly this will be available for you to actually go back to and take time to go through this recording as well with your teachers. But thank you so much to Rafi. Very much appreciated from the Emmanuel Synagogue today. And all the best with your study for your trials.
Good luck.
And certainly your revision after those as well. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.